Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some wolves. Today, joining Stephen and myself from his residence in Cable, Wisconsin, he's a retired wildlife biologist, among many other things, which we'll touch on today, Mr. Adrian Wydeven. Adrian, pleasure to meet you, and thank you for coming on the podcast. How are you doing in Wisconsin?
Yes, doing well. Thank you for having me, John and Stephen.
Absolutely. Our pleasure.
Yeah, we got the recommendation from, I believe, a friend of yours, Rachel Tilseth, up there in Wisconsin, and she said, you really need to speak with Adrian, and we've kind of been on this Wisconsin kick a little bit, and we thought you're really a perfect person to have and really continue this conversation. Just give everyone a little bit of a backstory and a background on yourself. I know you have a bachelor's in biology and wildlife management, and you have a master's in wildlife ecology, and you've gone on to do some amazing things. So just give everyone a little bit of a background on you personally and how you came to be a wildlife biologist.
Sure. I grew up in northeastern Wisconsin. I was actually born in the Netherlands. My family immigrated to the U.S. when I was 7 years old. We moved to northeastern Wisconsin and lived there until I went to college, and then went to college at UW Stevens Point in central Wisconsin, and did my undergrad degree there, and went on to do my master's degree at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa, where I studied elk in the Black Hills of South Dakota in Wind Cave National Park. Wow. And from there, I went on to doing various odd jobs before I worked as a wildlife manager in Missouri for a couple of years, and then 8 years in Wisconsin DNR as a wildlife manager before I started heading up the wolf recovery program in 1990. And from there, worked in that program through 2013, worked as a forest wildlife ecologist for the Wisconsin DNR for another couple of years before I retired in 2015. Since that time, I've been active as a volunteer working with the Timberwolf Alliance and a new organization called Wisconsin Green Fire, as well as still staying involved in doing volunteer surveys for the Department of Natural Resources, tracking wolves in the wintertime, doing wolf house surveys in the summertime, giving wolf talks periodically throughout the year, and staying engaged in wolf conservation issues as they come up.
So it's fair to say that you've done a tremendous amount of work over the course of your career. It's great. Tell us about when you get started in, I guess we'll start in the Department of Natural Resources, because that seems to really kick off because that's you're almost right out of college. What's your first roles in that organization, and you were studying elk, you said, in college. How do you go from going to elk and then working with predators as well?
Well, actually, even as an undergraduate, I was very interested in wolves. And back in the 1970s, before wolves had returned to Wisconsin, a friend of mine named Dick Thiel was going around in northern Wisconsin trying to survey and determine if there were any wolves left in the state. And so I did a little bit of that myself in 1973, 74, searching parts of the state to see if they were looking for tracks in the wintertime or trying to do some howling in the summertime. Never really found any wolves, but it sort of got me interested in wolves. And I was trying to get a graduate program working with large carnivores, but instead got an offer to do an ungulate study, which I thought, well, that's a prey of large carnivores. So learning about their prey is as important sometimes as learning about the predators. And so many experts on wolves are also experts on various ungulate species. So that seemed like a good opportunity. And I had a really great time in my graduate degree studying elk in the Black Hills in Wind Cave National Park, and ended up living there for about a year and a half studying the elk. Then out of college, initially spent a year doing odd jobs for the Fish and Wildlife Service for Missouri Department of Conservation and Iowa Department of Conservation before I got my first job as a wildlife manager in Missouri, and then a couple of years later, a wildlife manager in Wisconsin for the Department of Natural Resources, where you're broadly responsible for a variety of wildlife species, where you're kind of the expert of the wildlife within a county, two-county area. You do the surveys to determine the status of wildlife. You determine the harvest levels of deer and other wildlife species that are going to be occurring within your area. So you're working with the general public. You generally are working with lands that are devoted to wildlife management areas, trying to maintain healthy wildlife habitat, conducted prescribed burns, timber harvest to provide better forest habitat cover for them, planting various things. So it's kind of a production and maintenance of habitat for wildlife. And so they gave me a good background in the general understanding of the kind of things wildlife managers are doing to promote and secure wildlife habitat and manage wildlife populations. And in 1990, when an opening occurred as for a person to study and work with the wolf population, I applied for that and was lucky enough to get that position. In that position, actually half my job was working with wolves, the other half was working with other endangered mammals and other endangered and rare wildlife. So the focus was more on wolves, but also worked on a variety of other species, such as American marten, worked on a program to reintroduce elk to Wisconsin, worked with searching for cougars in Wisconsin, searching for Canada lynx, working with small mammals, bats, and a variety of other species.
Man, that's awesome. One, because you sent me a chapter that you co-authored that was, I believe it was part of the book, and please tell me if I'm wrong, the recovery of gray wolves in the Great Lakes region of the United States, an endangered species success story. And Wisconsin seems to be unique in a way that there's a lot of classified farmland as opposed to classified, I guess, forest or places where wild species can really habitate. What was the challenge when you first got there of trying to navigate those two types of places so that you can figure out a plan to reintroduce or help these populations be managed in an ecological way?
Sure, and that was a big challenge. When I was going to college in the 1970s, when wolves were extinct in Wisconsin, we thought Wisconsin was no longer suitable as a state for having wolves. And let me just back up a little bit on the history of wolves in Wisconsin, that Wisconsin had wolves that lasted until the late 1950s, one of the last places in the lower 48 states to still have a gray wolf population. They did persist in Minnesota beyond that, but they became extinct in Wisconsin by the late 1950s. And for about 15 years, wolves were extirpated, extinct in this state. And starting in the mid-70s, they started returning on their own from that Minnesota population. As a result of the Endangered Species Act, both the state and the federal Endangered Species Act that provided high levels of protection of that Minnesota population allowed them to spread. But at the time in the mid-70s, we questioned whether Wisconsin had enough wild land to support a wolf population. We were sort of under the impression that wolves were a wilderness species, and that's how often they were depicted in the past, that they only could live in places that were pristine, large wilderness areas. And the largest wilderness in Wisconsin is 28 square miles, which is not even half the size of an average packed area. So we know that Wisconsin didn't have the sort of wilderness areas that we thought they were going to need. But about half the state is forested. A little bit less than 20% of the state is public lands. And we do have a very healthy deer population. Typically, hunters are harvesting several 100,000 deer per year. As many as 600,000 deer were harvested a few years ago. The population statewide is probably about 1.5 million most years. So we have a very healthy deer population. And with the recovery of a lot of wild lands in the early 1900s, after forests were cut over in Wisconsin, lands were converted were made into national forest and county forest and started being managed on a sustainable basis. And this ended up recovering a lot of wild lands and enough wild areas that could support a wolf population. So our thoughts initially was that Wisconsin was not going to be wild enough, but what we found is a combination of that. If human tolerance is great enough, if there's high enough levels of protection, and if you got suitable areas of forest and healthy ungulate populations, healthy prey populations, you can support a wolf population in areas that are much less wild than what we thought initially. And we've been doing GIS, Geographical Information System, analysis of wolf habitat in Wisconsin. And in the mid-90s, we thought the state was big enough to maybe hold about 500 wolves. The most recent analysis we've done suggested there's probably 1,200. We probably could support over 1,200 wolves. So we went from thinking Wisconsin could not support any wolves to now knowing the state has room for over 1,000 wolves. And that population has done very well in this state now.
When you say that you didn't think there was enough wild space, does that mean that there's a lot of wolf packs potentially settling on private land?
Yes, most packs do live on private land. Many packs live on private land in Wisconsin. We do have some amount of public lands, and that often seems to be some of the core of the best areas for wolf habitat are the public lands, but they do occur on private lands. And then there's different levels of private lands. There are private lands where it's forest owners who mainly own the land, either as hunting land or for timber production, and some of them probably don't mind wolves. And then there's private land where it's farmland and people raising livestock, and they probably don't appreciate wolves very much at all. So it varies quite a bit depending on what the private land is being used for.
Right.
But we do find that wolves seem to gravitate toward forested areas and avoid agricultural areas. So one of the advantages to wolves in Wisconsin that some of the western states don't have is that we don't have public grazing of rangelands. So our national forests, our county forests, state forests don't have cattle on them. Unlike western states where most of the public lands also are places where livestock are grazing. So livestock are mainly just in pastures around farmsteads. So they're more confined in more specific areas and not as broadly spread over across the landscapes. And that's been one of the advantages that we have for allowing the spread of our wolf population, that there aren't nearly as many places as in some of the western states where they're going to get into conflicts. Generally, most years, less than 15% of packs in Wisconsin cause depredation on livestock. So most packs are just living on wild prey and are not causing problems.
Yeah, I mean, you seem to have plenty of, I didn't know that either. It's amazing. There seems to be a ton of ungulates there, considering the numbers you were talking about just in the deer. Did you find early on when you guys were looking for wolves and then trying to see if they would come back after the ESA was passed and they had protections, that the repopulation that you were doing with the elk, and I think it was just elk that you were mentioning before, that those sort of coincided for both those species to sort of come back into Wisconsin again at the same time and, rewild those forests?
Well, the wolves were here before the elk, and one of the kind of an interesting thing is in 1995, when wolves are being reintroduced into Yellowstone and Idaho in areas where there were healthy elk populations, we were reintroducing elk into northwest Wisconsin where we had growing wolf populations. So we did it kind of the other way around here. So the elk are still a fairly small population. I think we've got about 500 elk in the state right now. They're still a fairly minor aspect of the diet of wolves. There are a few packs that have become more specialized on elk, those living right in the elk range. But in general, very few wolves in Wisconsin encounter elk. We have a very small moose population of maybe 30, 40 animals. So those would be the other ungulates. But we have very healthy beaver populations, and that's also an important food source for many of our wolves.
Wow, so they're just adapting all away. I mean, that's actually good to know that they're. Have you noticed in your wildlife management days, and now that you're retired, but do you see that the wolves are helping in some way to keep the deer population, I don't want to say in check, because there's, if you're saying there's 1.5 million and hunters are still taking hundreds of thousands and that population is still healthy enough, do you see the wolves helping in that area in sort of keeping those populations strong and healthy in the deer population?
We're seeing some of that. Now, if there are hunters who will blame the lack of deer in their area on wolves, even though we overall have a healthy wolf population. I have a healthy deer population. There are probably areas in the state and some of the dense forest areas where there's very mature forest that the deer populations have declined over time. Wolves are a factor to some extent they're probably also a factor in just affecting the movement patterns of deer, so that with the presence of a wolf population, deer may not be as visible. So hunters get the impression there's less deer in the landscape because they're just not seeing them as readily because the deer are sticking closer to dense cover. So the changes in behavior probably have some impact as well. But our deer populations have not really drastically reduced, but they probably have declined some. One of the things that's especially interesting is that in southern Wisconsin, where we don't have wolves in more of our farmland areas, Wisconsin has got a major outbreak of chronic wasting disease, which is starting to have some real impacts on our deer population in areas where the deer herds are way too high and they're not really exposed to predators. And that's probably been one of the factors that have allowed the spread of this disease. And so far, we have not seen extensive spread of chronic wasting disease into wolf-occupied areas. So wolves may be one of the big factors that will prevent the spread of that disease into the north woods of Wisconsin, into the forested areas of Wisconsin. We're also seeing impacts on vegetation. We've had several research projects looking at understory plants and found that in areas where we have wolf packs, there's a richer diversity of understory plants. There's less heavy browsing on sensitive plants. Some of the small trees that are seedlings that are growing, that will grow up into the next forest, are not as heavily browsed in areas where we've got a wolf population. So it has those kind of ecological benefits, and that may be from some reduction of the deer population, but also just moving the deer herd around, and kind of we perceive the wolves as sort of the shepherds of the deer herd, kind of keeping them moving on the landscape.
I think that's kind of an underrated point, actually. Potentially, it's hard to tell the difference between a deer herd that's suffering and a deer herd that's just behaving completely differently in comparison to how they were behaving before there were predators on the landscape, because surely a group of deer that hasn't had that type of pressure for however long they haven't had that type of pressure is going to behave almost unrecognizably to the local hunters who've been hunting that herd of deer without wolves on the landscape. I think that's an important distinction, because it's a thing that I've heard a lot, which is, well, since the wolves are back, my local unit seems to be struggling. There doesn't seem to be as many elk or as many deer around. Potentially, they're just behaving totally different, using different migratory routes, using different traveling routes, bedding at different times, in the end, behaving more naturally.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting, all the things that you laid out there, because and you brought up CWD, which we've touched on with multiple guests. It seems like more so recently, as we've sort of moved our podcast guests a little bit more eastward. When we talked to Mike Phillips and Carter Niemeyer and Rachel Tilseth as well in Wisconsin, it seems to be that this CWD is becoming an issue, more so that can't necessarily only be controlled by hunting. It seems to be that is the way to get rid of a lot of it, or cull the herds as best you can. Is there any thought or any management plan that you know of that is trying to possibly bring wolves into that southern part of Wisconsin, or is that not a viable way for them to help cull those herds?
Yeah, I don't think it's viable. I think our best bet is maintaining a healthy wolf population in the places that wolves are selecting and to live, and that is suitable habitat. I think trying to force wolves in the more agricultural parts of southern Wisconsin is not likely to be successful, probably going to lead to more livestock depredation issues, and getting wolves to stay within the prescribed areas. You have to do some acclimation pens, and I think public relations wise, there just would not be acceptance for doing that. So I don't think that's a viable alternative. I think our best bet is to maintain healthy wolf populations in the areas that they select to live. And I don't see wolves by themselves being the answer to CWD, but I think it's part of the solution. And I think we have to look at a variety of tools for controlling chronic wasting disease. And a lot of it is going to be dealing with the hunters and reducing the size of deer herd, and especially reducing deer in areas where there's high levels of infection. But I think wolves can play a role, but they're not going to be the main tool to control chronic wasting disease.
Now, when you talk about wolves staying in these prescribed or selected for areas, I mean, is this kind of just a perpetual having to monitor that they are staying in the right places and controlling them, or is there a point where they're just going to select for those areas and not leave those areas, or is this just kind of a never-ending monitoring?
Well, I think monitoring is kind of an ongoing activity, but yeah, the wolves in part are selecting the areas where they're able to live, where they don't get killed off. And when they move into more highly developed landscapes, where there's a higher density of roads, less forest cover, greater risk of being shot accidentally or intentionally, then their ability to survive in those areas are going to be much more difficult. If there are places where they're going to more regularly encounter livestock and more likely to become nuisance animals, then they're going to be likely to be controlled. So I think we're getting to a point in Wisconsin where we're kind of finding that line is where this is about as far as they can go without the mortalities are being too high for them, and the controls will start to play become a factor in restricting where they're going to be able to live. And when we've got heavily forested areas with limited livestock and low density of roads, those seem to be the places that do best for wolves. That's where they survive the best. When you start getting higher density of roads, you start getting livestock more often, they become more of a nuisance animal, more risk of being a nuisance animal, and more chance of being killed. So I think we're sort of getting to that level. Now, Wisconsin does have a public hunting season, and that probably will be another factor that sort of restricts them to the more heavily forested parts of the state. So I think a combination of the management factors in place and just the landscape itself and the wolves' ability to survive there are going to be big factors. And one of the big challenges always has been is keeping illegal killing to low levels and maintaining reasonable levels of tolerance toward wolves. And I think that's easier to do if you maintain and promote a healthy wolf population on our more wildland areas. But if we try to promote wolves in areas where there's high levels of conflicts, where they're going to encounter people and their pets and their livestock more regularly, I think the tolerance is going to go down. So we do have the responsibility of managing them at a level that we think the public is willing to accept, and that it's going to maintain a healthy wolf population without creating too much negative attitudes toward them.
What's the tolerance level that you feel between the public and the wolf populations where it stands right now? Because it seems as though you from everything I'm gathering, you're saying it seems as though there is this line where everyone who is south of that line or southeast of that line is leaving the wolves basically to roam where they want to roam, and the wolves aren't encroaching on their livestock, their agricultural areas. So where do you find public perception or the reception of this is at this juncture, before we get into, I guess some of the other the wolf hunts and things like that? Where do you perceive the public's perception of this is at the moment?
There have been several studies of attitudes toward wolves in Wisconsin going back to the 1990s. And in general, what we've seen is a reduction in tolerance toward wolves. And that could be sort of predicted in that some large studies of wolf attitudes have generally showed that the attitudes toward wolves decline when areas are occupied by wolves. In places where there are wolves living, the tolerance toward wolves tends to be less than places where wolves are not living. And as more of the state is occupied by wolves, more of the state is under those kind of conditions where people have had negative experience with wolves, or they know of somebody who's had a negative experience with a wolf. And so if somebody lost a pet to a wolf or lost livestock, that person is probably going to be very negative toward wolves. And some of their friends and their neighbors that they talk to and the reports that the papers will do on those incidents will probably also create levels of negativity. I think creating positive attitudes is probably more difficult to do than creating negative attitudes. Negative attitudes can occur very quickly. Most people are probably neutral toward wolves until they either study them and learn about them and get excited about them, or they have a negative experience with wolves. And if you lost a pet to a wolf, or you came out to your pasture and you had a calf killed by wolves, and even though you will be reimbursed for it, and when they're not listed as an endangered species, you can have a federal trapper come over and remove that wolf. It's still a negative experience for a person, and there's sort of a gut reaction to that, which is good. And that person, even though they're going to get reimbursed and have a federal trapper remove the wolf, they're probably not, their tolerance toward wolf is going to be probably relatively low. And they're going to be they may not be sleeping as well at nights, worrying about if there's additional depredations. If there's a calf missing, they're going to have to spend more time searching for them. So it's going to create some animosity toward wolves by some people. So the general attitudes toward wolves have declined somewhat, but the most recent attitude surveys show that majority of Wisconsin residents, even the people in wolf range, still support healthy wolf populations. So there is still support for a healthy wolf population, but the percentage of people that have become negative toward wolves has probably grown some. I know that in the 1990s, as we were preparing for our wolf plan at the time, we did a survey of hunters, and most hunters were favorable toward wolves. And I think it was about 60-70% of hunters favored having a healthy wolf population. I think if you did that same survey now, it'd probably be less, because some of them see less deer in the landscape and they're going to blame the wolf population for part of that. One of the things that we went through in our deer population is our deer population grew to extremely high levels. I told you that we had deer harvests of over 500,000 back in the early 2000s, and the population had to be reduced. And it was a kind of a planned activity. There were more permits issued to remove antlerless deer. And then we had some series of more severe winters. So the population did go down from those extremely high levels. But people who started hunting deer when that deer population was in that bubble stage, that's what they expect to see as a regular deer population. And now with less deer on the landscape, knowing at the same time we've had this growth in the wolf population, the wolves kind of get blamed for the reduction of the deer herd. But that was kind of a planned activity, because we are having devastating impacts of overbrowsing on our forest, high levels of problems with farms from the high deer herd, high levels of vehicle collisions on roadways. And those things have sort of declined now with getting the deer herd more under control. So, so that's one of the things that will drive the attitudes toward wolves, is people's perceptions of how they're competing with them, or if they've had any negative incidents with wolves in the past.
Yeah, that paints a very clear picture of the broader scope of things. I think this brings us to the wolf hunt topic. I was reading an article, I think you wrote it, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was called "Wisconsin's Wolf Hunt was not based on science." And I just want to get a little bit more into that idea. If it doesn't feel like the hunt was based in science, what is it based in, and what does that point to you personally, in terms of, I guess, what it says about the priority of Wisconsin politics?
Well, I think that's it. Politics and special interest groups, and there were special interest groups who wanted to reduce the wolf population and wanted to rush into a hunt as soon as they could, and didn't want science to stand in the way, and were able to use politics and the courts to get their way as far as having the hunt. I'm not opposed to some kind of a regulated hunting season on wolves if it's well regulated and carefully monitored and based on scientific assessment of what quotas should be to maintain a sustainable, healthy wolf population. Maybe allow some reductions in areas where there are conflicts, but in general, try to achieve a stable wolf population across the state. But the season that was held was just rushed into any time that was really not inappropriate to be hunting wolves in the middle of the breeding season, and using a method that no other state allows, of using hounds to run down the wolves, and turned out to be very efficient and effective system for killing a lot of wolves over a very short period of time.
So had the hunt or the decision to have the hunt been based in real science, how do you feel it might have been different, or is that too sort of hypothetical at this point?
Well, one of the things that we strongly urged with the department and urged the Natural Resource Board, which is the agency, the governance of the DNR, of the Department of Natural Resources was to wait until fall to hold a hunting season. Wait until, as they had done in 2012, 2013, 2014, when we previously had wolf hunting seasons.
Right.
And the way the wolf hunting season started would be in mid-October was when they were holding them in 2012, 13, 14. That was revised to now the starting date would be the first Saturday in November, but that would allow hunters and trappers to start hunting at those times. The use of dogs was not allowed until after the firearm deer season, which is the end of November. And so in the past, dogs were not used at all in 2012 and only one of 6 management zones in 2013 and just for a very short period of time in 2 zones in 2014. So dogs had not been used extensively in the past, whereas the season, running it in midwinter in February, all zones were open up to using hounds for hunting wolves, and resulting in 86% of the harvest being by hunters using hounds. So a very aggressive control factor that was very difficult to monitor, difficult to track, and difficult for the department to close the season in time to hold the harvest to the quota that the department had set. But when the department had set seasons in this fall, they were able to close the seasons within a wolf or 2 of their quotas most of the time. So the department did not go drastically over the quotas that they had set for the wolf population, and those are quotas that are based on best available science, having a team of biologists looking at the statistics and having tribal involvement in setting the season and determining the level of harvest that would be allowed for each of those seasons. That wasn't allowed for this last season. The department had to just quickly come up with a quick quota. And then one of the Natural Resource Board members ended up doubling the numbers of permits that were allowed for harvesting that quota, which also was one of the reasons resulting in a very over-harvest of this population. So the quota that the department initially recommended was 200, but there's also obligations that within the ceded territories of some of the Chippewa tribes in the northern third of Wisconsin, the tribes can request up to half of any allowable harvest on wildlife species within that ceded territory. And they requested 100 wolves not be harvested within that area. The state offered them, the department offered them 81 wolves, so reduced the quota to 119. But in the end, ended out harvesting 216 wolves anyway, so it still went over the quota, the 119 quota that it had intentionally attempted to harvest at, and even went over the 200 that was the initial quota before they supposedly had protected portions of that quota for the tribe.
Yeah, that was completely related to my next question, which is I was curious what the sense is of why the Wisconsin Natural Resources Board and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources were so in disagreement about the number of permits that could be given out. Are they sort of catering to different interests or?
Well, part of it is, I think, dealing with a lot of unknowns, uncertainty. The department really didn't know what level of harvest they're going to achieve in a February hunt because we've never done that. So wolves have not been hunted in February in Wisconsin since 1956. So we have no experience with that. So the permits that were initially issued or recommended by the Department of Natural Resources was for every wolf to be harvested, that be 10 permits issued. And the Natural Resource Board doubled that. And the rationale being because the wolf season was going to be only 6 days long, or 6 or 7 days long, that it would be highly unlikely the hunters would be able to harvest enough wolves anyway, so issue enough permits so that many more wolves could be hunted, based on high levels of uncertainty, but perception that with the short period of time that hunters were not likely to be as successful. But again, in previous hunts, we weren't dealing with use of hounds to any great extent, so we really didn't have much of a measure on what the impact of the use of hounds would be.
Yeah, that seemed to be a bone of contention with the use of hounds, and sort of I guess it's an illegal hunting method in that area. My question too, I get to piggyback off of what Stephen was saying, is there seems to be a disagreement or a differing of the amount of wolves that is considered a healthy population within the state, and a lot of these states that we've talked about in Montana and Idaho, even in Yellowstone, as to how well they're recovered and things of that sort. When you're doing the population assessments, when they're talking about these hunts, where does the conversation go as to whether this is a recovered and healthy population and that this is the number where it needs to stay at, or are they allowing leeway either way? Because that seems to be where some of this, like you said, the amount of tags that were given were exponentially more, and use of certain hunting methods were allowed. So what's the rationale behind the number that Wisconsin is trying to have as its secure wolf population?
The Wisconsin DNR last approved management plan was approved in 1999, and that set a goal for the state of 350 wolves. And I was the chair of that committee that put that plan together. The 350 represented kind of a political compromise. At the time, our assessment of habitat suggested that Wisconsin could hold about 500 wolves. And we did some population viability analysis that suggested a population of 300, 400, or 500 wolves would be fairly viable, have low risk of going extinct within the next 100 years, low risk of having to be relisted again in the next 100 years. So the team initially had recommended a goal of 300 to 500 wolves, but in the process of developing the plan, you go through committee meetings, you go through roundtable discussions, you go through various political compromises, and we compromised on a state delisting goal of 250 wolves and a state management goal of 350 wolves. Now, that was intended to be a management goal at a time there were less than 200 wolves in Wisconsin. So it was a goal to be achieved and hold a population close to that, but then to review that goal every 5 years to see whether it was still a reasonable goal or not. Unfortunately, we have not really had an opportunity to thoroughly re-examine that goal. There was a minor adjustment to the management plan in 2007, but none since then. And that plan now is really outdated, based on outdated information. And that was based on our assumption that the carrying capacity was about 500 wolves, where our current understanding is the carrying capacity is probably closer to 1,250 wolves. So we know the state can hold a lot more wolves. And in wildlife management, population management, typically you want to manage your population within at least more than half of the carrying capacity, normally about 2/3 to 3/4 of the carrying capacity. You don't want to manage them with less than half the carrying capacity. So that puts the population in a very precarious position where the population becomes highly unstable. So you want to keep it well above the halfway point. So there are a lot of people and groups that feel the 350 was a cap that was intended to keep the population at that level, and that we need to reduce the population to that level. The department is starting a process of updating that plan, and hopefully will revise that management goal in the near future. But the groups that I represent, the Timberwolf Alliance and the Wisconsin Green Fire, are going to push really hard in the next hunts to make sure we keep the population at current levels until a approved management plan is in place, and that 350 plan is not, the 350 goal is not an appropriate goal for managing the current wolf population.
So is there also going to be a fall hunt? And if there is, how did this, I don't know, sort of unconventional timing for this hunt, how is that going to affect how they set quotas and how they set management goals for the fall?
Yeah, unfortunately, one of the big dilemmas we deal with in Wisconsin is that in 2012, when wolves were delisted, our state legislature wrote a wolf hunting bill that says the DNR shall hold a wolf hunting trapping season if they're not on the state or federal endangered or threatened species list. So the Department of Natural Resources has no choice but to hold a wolf hunt in fall.
Wow.
So there will be a wolf hunt in the fall. There's no question about that, unless for some reason they go back on the endangered species list. And there have been challenges to wolf listing, and there's a possibility wolves may be relisted again. But in the past, when those challenges have occurred, they typically take about 1.5 years to go through the courts. So that would be it was sometime in spring of 2022 before those lawsuits are likely to be revised or to be completed. So I don't see the fall hunt being not being done this year. But our hope is, and I'm serving on the committee that's going to be recommending the quota for the department. Our hope is to keep that quota down to a very low level to minimize any impact. One of the difficulties with this last winter's hunt is, unlike a hunt that you hold in the fall, it's almost like an accounting system. You know how many wolves you have on the landscape. You can subtract from the population the number of animals you knew were hunted or harvested, and gives you about the animals that were left after the hunting season. The problem with the winter hunt is that we removed a lot of females, probably that had pups in them already. So the impact goes beyond just those females, because those packs are not going to be producing any pups this year. And packs that have lost some of the males will also probably have difficulty, where you've only left a female behind without a male to feed her and feed her pups. And instead of her spending time nursing her pups, she's going to have to spend more time out hunting, leave her pups more exposed to potential predators, and potentially not providing enough food for them, and them starving. So both scenarios, the adult females and adult males being removed, will likely reduce the level of pup production this spring. That will go far beyond just the impacts of removing those animals from the population this winter. And trying to figure out what those impacts are, I think it'll probably be a couple of years before we have a really good sense what the impact is. But so our groups are going to push really hard to keep the quota down to a very low level to minimize impacts on the population.
So after that hunt, where the quota was exceeded by such a high number, how can the DNR sort of be confident that they know even the current status of the wolf population? I mean, is there a rush by wolf biologists to sort of survey the current population to, I don't know, maybe prove that that after that hunt, a reinstatement of ESA protections is warranted, or to minimize the quota for the fall? Or what's kind of going on around that uncertainty, which I assume is uncertain?
Well, we do have ongoing surveys of the wolf population. Each winter, we do a combination of track surveys, and in the past, you do radio telemetry flights of collared packs, and there's collection of public observations, especially people with trail cameras, and using that information to then determine the number of wolves on the landscape. And I'm, along with my work with these organizations, I am also a volunteer tracker with the department, and I'm also a regional coordinator, so I coordinate and mentor other trackers within a large area. And so we've been doing our track surveys this winter. Unfortunately, after the hunt ended, the conditions for tracking quickly deteriorated, so not many surveys will have been done after the hunt. Most of the surveys will have been done before the hunt. The department will be able to adjust those counts somewhat by subtracting the animals known to be harvested this winter, but unfortunately we aren't going to be able to assess exactly what the impacts are. So some kind of assumptions are going to have to be made on those numbers, on the level of production of pups this spring, based on what happens in other wolf populations in other areas. So there's going to have to be some adjustment, I think, of the numbers to assess what we think the population is. And of course, when we're hunting the wolves in the fall, we don't know what the actual population is at that time, because the actual population surveys are done in the wintertime. So it would have been the previous winter that population would have been counted. And typically what we find is the population probably doubles in the springtime when the pups are born. in our area, if you've got 1,000 wolves on the landscape, and that's 250 packs, and each pack has a female that's producing 5 pups on the average, that's going to double your population in a short period of time. But we find that only about 30% of those pups survive to the end of their first year.
Yeah.
So some of those pups will, but more of them will be on the landscape in the fall yet than there would be by the winter time. So what we have found in previous hunts, when they're done in 2012 and 13 and 14, nearly half the wolves that were harvested were young of the year, pups from that previous spring. By fall, when they're being hunted, they are adult-size animals, and most hunters don't recognize them. You need almost an expert to be able to tell that they're pups versus adult-sized animals. But looking at their teeth, then you can determine that they're actually just pups. Right. And about a quarter are yearlings, so those are animals that still haven't started reproducing yet. So 3/4 of the wolves being removed in the fall hunts were animals that are not of non-reproductive age. So their impacts on the populations were much more minimum than when potentially you're removing adult animals from that population.
That brings up an interesting question that I had never thought of before, at least in terms of wolf hunting. When agencies set regulations or guidelines for method of take or seasons, there is also included in that a list of rules about what animals can be harvested based on sex or anatomical features that communicate age, like tines or antler size or a 360 curl on sheep, for example. How do they set similar rules for hunting wolves when they're a little bit more ambiguous? It's harder to tell age or even sex.
And that's one of the dilemmas in any kind of a wolf hunt. You have to set up regulations that assumes that people aren't going to know. And what we know now is that if you set a harvest in the fall, majority will probably be the young of the year. And those are the animals that have probably the least impact on the population, because we know the young of the year do go through fairly high levels of mortality as it is. And they're not reproducing members of the population yet at that point. So, but you have to sort of make assumptions on based on previous years, the percentage from the various categories are likely to be hunted. And certain methods perhaps have different effects. We know that in the case of trapping, that probably especially tends to capture younger animals more readily because they've had no experience with traps. The shooting of wolves over bait, the other practice used in the fall, that's a little bit more it's less selective, so that's you're probably more likely to harvest adult animals. We don't know yet the effect of the hunting with hounds on the selectivity and the animals that are removed from the population, because those animals have not been aged yet, or at least the ages haven't been reported yet. So whether the same makeup exists for this winter hunt as in the fall. But that is an important point to make, is that you can't make distinctions, allow just the hunting of males or females or certain animals. Even in cougar hunts, a lot of times if dogs are used and they're allowed to tree the cougar, hunters can often distinguish the males from the females. Whereas in the case of wolf hunting, there's no way you're going to be, I'm sure the hunters are shooting whatever animal gets in front of them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's so unfortunate. I want to touch on the tribes, because I don't think I asked this question before, and we had a couple other individuals on. What's the role of the Chippewas and the tribes in the northern part of the state? Because they seem to have at least some sort of influence on the numbers, as you were saying before, and maybe how the hunts can be handled. Are they a viable resource with yourself and the groups that you're a part of to really sort of mitigate how these hunts are done if they have to be done?
Sure, yeah, and we are trying to work closely with the tribes. The Chippewa probably have the most ability to have some kind of impact, because they have these treaties that granted them up to half of the allowable harvest of any harvestable wildlife within the areas of their ceded territories, which is about a third of the state of Wisconsin. So they can request up to half of allowable harvest of wildlife. And in the case of wolves, they requested the allowable half of the allowable harvest, but without intentions of killing them. And they argue that they also have a right to keep live animals on the landscape because they have ecological benefits for them and cultural benefits for them. Whether that's going to be continued in the future, to what extent, I'm not sure. That I know in the hunts that were held in 2012 and 13 and 14, the first year of the hunt, they were given half of the allowable harvest within the northern ceded territories. The second year, because they weren't actually removing animals, they were giving only a quarter of the allowable, and I think it was a quarter of that the year after that. So because they weren't actually removing animals, they were given less percentage of the actual allowable harvest in additional years. I'm not sure how that's going to work in future years and to what extent the tribes are going to have some impact on that. The other thing in Wisconsin is we do have other tribes. We have the Menominee, we have the Potawatomi, the Ho-Chunk, the Stockbridge, Munsee, the Oneida, that also have lands within wolf areas and have interest in wolves. Those tribes don't have the sort of treaty rights, but they do have the rights to, on their reservation lands, to close them to hunting. And one of the things the tribes have requested is to allow them to have some buffer areas around their reservations where wolves would also be protected. The unfortunate thing is about most of the reservations in Wisconsin are relatively small, and the packs living on reservations for most part also extend beyond the reservation boundaries. So there's probably not more than one or two wolf packs on a reservation that doesn't also extend outside the reservations. So they're potentially also exposed to hunting seasons, and the tribes are requesting having buffer areas created around the reservations to provide additional protection for those packs. And we are, Timberwolf Alliance and Wisconsin Green Fire are trying to work with the state to try to provide such buffer areas. We think the tribal lands by themselves are important conservation areas for wolves. And we believe that having some areas close to wolf hunting really has benefits to wolf conservation overall, and the tribes are willing to provide those lands, but we need to make those areas a little bit more secure so they can protect whole packs from being harvested. Currently, all those packs are still somewhat exposed to some potential of harvest when they travel outside of reservation boundaries.
So describe what Timberwolf Alliance and Wisconsin Green Fire are about and their mission statements, because I know you've touched on them a lot, and I want to give them their just due because you're a huge part of those. So just give everybody what Timberwolf Alliance is all about and Wisconsin Green Fire and their effects on the wolf population there in Wisconsin.
Yeah, sure. So Timberwolf Alliance is the older organization. They've been around since 1987. They initially formed when the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources was working on its first recovery plan. And they formed as a volunteer organizations to support the recovery of wolves in Wisconsin, and then eventually spread into Michigan as wolves also spread into Michigan. And their goal is to try to achieve a sustainable population of wolves within areas of suitable habitat across Wisconsin and Michigan and other areas of the U.S. And they're mostly educational organization, also promoting sound science in wolf conservation. The second organization, Wisconsin Green Fire, just recently formed in 2017, and many of the people who've read Aldo Leopold will know that Green Fire represents one of his essays talking about thinking like a mountain, where after having shot this female wolf and walking up to her and seeing the green fire dying in her eyes, recognized that there was much more to the wolf than just the animal, and that both she and the mountain felt that there is a value in keeping wolves on the landscape. And so Green Fire is an organization that promotes sound natural resource management based on sound science. And it includes a lot of areas of natural resource management, environmental issues, as well as wildlife issues. So, but wolf conservation is one of the issues that we're working on in the Wisconsin Green Fire.
Yeah, we've talked about that quote so many times. It's like, it's about time we just suggest to all of our listeners that you have to read the Sand County Almanac. It's one of the best books of all time.
No, it definitely is. Yeah, it's been the third or fourth mention that we've had of it. Do you feel with the Timberwolf Alliance specifically that you are making any sort of headway in producing sound facts for the public at large so that they are able to understand the true numbers about the populations in Wisconsin and also as they encroach into Michigan, and the benefits for these populations to stay healthy, and in other words, to get the truth out there and have these conversations or these symposiums based in fact and science, that it's helping the population at large in both of these states to really understand how the wolf is a benefit to the natural environment?
I think Timberwolf Alliance, has been successful to some extent, but I think the issues are changing over time. When Timberwolf Alliance first started, the biggest issue was just getting facts and factual information out on wolves and discouraging people from illegally killing wolves. And we see, if you look at the growth of the Wisconsin wolf population, the growth of the population in Michigan, the populations really took off in the 1990s at a time period that Timberwolf Alliance was really starting to take hold. Other wolf organizations, such as the Timberwolf Information Network in Wisconsin, the International Wolf Center was really getting going at that time. Sierra Club, Defenders of Wildlife were really ramping up their wolf educational efforts. So it seemed like there was an intense level of wolf educational efforts at that time. And it parallels the growth of the Wisconsin wolf population into the early 2000s. I think what we see after that is, as the populations have got to these higher levels, some of the negative impacts of the wolf populations have started to come out. And the publicity on those have come out more, that as the population has grown, we've had more incidents of wolves also killing livestock, and some of those get played up in the news and maybe exaggerated to some extent. And you have the farmer talking to the newspaper person or on television or radio, and the farmer's upset and distressed because of the wolves that killed some of his livestock, and those kind of stories, I think, sort of started creating some backlashes. I think there's also a great deal of frustration in the Great Lakes region in that we've been on and off the endangered species list 4 different times. And I think it's created almost animosity toward wolves in general and animosity toward the Endangered Species Act. I think people are feeling that this is a recovered population. It should be managed by the states and the tribes. Putting it back on endangered species list, I think, just kind of creates frustration and this backlash. And we've seen a growth in levels of poaching in Wisconsin and to some extent in Michigan. Levels of poaching are very high in the early years when wolves were first returning to Wisconsin in the late 70s, early 1980s. But it seemed like by the late 1980s, early 90s, poaching started to really decline. And then we see it in the 2000s starting to increase again. And now it's probably getting close to levels that we had in the early 1980s. So, we're seeing a bit of a backlash toward the wolf population. So the needs for organizations like Timberwolf Alliance, like your organization's Wolf Connections, to educate people about wolves becomes even greater. And the issues are becoming more complex. In the past, it was wolves are good, they have ecological benefits, they help balance the prey populations, and please don't kill them. And those were the simple messages we could give in the 1990s, but now it's more complex in how we coexist and how we live with wolves on the landscape. And in some places that may mean allowing some levels of lethal controls. In other places, it may mean keeping things totally protected. And it's going to be a variety of things across the landscape. And we need organizations like Timberwolf Alliance to explain those to people, what is going on and why it's being done this way.
Yeah, the more we talk about the relationship between wolves and the ESA, the more I wonder how much of the animosity towards these types of, pro-wolf efforts is about that. Folks feeling like they're kind of being manipulated the wolves come off, they go on, the goalpost keeps getting moved for how many equals reintroduction. Is there any part of you that thinks, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here, but is there any part of you that thinks they have a point, that type of coming on and coming off and moving the number that amounts to successful reintroduction sort of compromises the integrity of that process?
Well, I think I certainly understand why different numbers can be used at different points of a population. The problem is people see this, just as you point out, the moving of the goalpost. We had a 80 wolves delisting goals for the state, or a downlisting goal in the state of Wisconsin. 80 wolves when you could consider them a threatened species. 250 was the delisting goal. 350 was the previous management goal. And people see these numbers being changed and say, well, first you wanted 80, then you wanted 250, then you wanted 350, right, and see it kind of as an incremental. Well, you're constantly asking, you said you only wanted so many, and now you're asking for more. So that is probably part of the problem. It creates this sense that this goalpost is constantly being moved, and they're being promised the state is going to have management authority at a certain level, and that level keeps changing and changing on them. So I think that creates frustration and people reacting to the Endangered Species Act and blaming it on those acts. And often it isn't so much the wolf as I think the perception of what the wolf is. It's big government being pushed down on people, and rural opinions not being considered, and those Madison people or those Washington people telling people in the Northwoods or telling people in the remote areas of the country how to live their lives. And so I think it's perceived more as this big government intrusion into people's lives. It had been my hope when we completed our 1999 plan that wolves were going to be delisted within a year or two, and we were going to have a fairly smooth transition from state management from federal management to state management. In the Great Lakes region, unlike the western states, most of the recovery work had been done by the state wildlife agencies. The federal government, Fish and Wildlife Service, provided some funding and cooperation, but the actual work on the ground of tagging wolves, monitoring their populations, doing depredation control work were by state people. So it seemed like we were going to be an easy transition from federal listing to state listing. And we thought we were going to be a good example that states such as Maine or Colorado could use, that you have them listed as an endangered species for a while. The states ramps up their management of the wolf population. They put in a good plan in place. The federal government passes it over to the state, and it becomes a state managed species. We were hoping that we were going to be a good model for that, but unfortunately, this back and forth has not allowed us to be that model. And I think right now there's probably more of an attitude from state agencies is they don't want wolves there, not because they don't want wolves, but they don't want to go through this kind of back and forth management. Do we have management authority? Don't we have management authority? Do we lose management authority? Do we gain management authority? So I think that's created a lot of animosity toward wolves and toward wolf management.
Yeah, when you put it that way, a lot of this wolf conversation is very unique to wolves, as their situation is very unique. But this particular thing is not very unique to wolves, as it's sort of like the climate right now in our country, which is there are a lot of groups that are fearful that other groups are trying to sort of chip away at their rights, whether it be gun control or hunting, for example, harvesting wild food. Many people may not care about losing certain fringe group activities, but they may still be concerned that, of the concept, you give them one thing, then the next thing is something that's going to be totally unreasonable to us. And we just open up those floodgates for more. And I think the wolf scenario has a lot of that theme in it. And of course, again, it makes it clear, and we've said this before, that this is more humans communicating ineffectively.
Yeah, it's kind of indicative of a lot of how our government is working right now. And, the same accusations on COVID-19 it's a government plot to take greater control and forcing us to wear masks and not allow us to gather.
Right. If we wear the mask, what's it going to be next is kind of the thing that people are thinking.
Yeah. I mean, so what's the path forward, do you think, for, as part of the Timberwolf Alliance? What's the path for you all to try to bridge these gaps that, either fairly or unfairly are being made that are out of your control? Is it more cooperation between, I don't want to say livestock individuals who are in the southern part of the state? Is it trying to reach across and talk with some of the hunters and talk with them and the Wisconsin DNR, with the tribes? What do you see as the path forward for Wisconsin and Michigan and the Great Lakes states then?
Well, I think we continue to do educational programs and maybe have to change some of the emphasis in the programs and maybe use different ways of getting that message out. Newsletters and things like that of the past are probably not nearly as suitable now. Making short videos, the YouTube videos on different aspects of wolf ecology and wolf management, and just dispelling some of the myths about wolves, and continue to do that. But also work with the state agencies, work with the tribes. Both Wisconsin Green Fire and Timberwolf Alliance do have seats on the Wolf Harvest Committee, the wolf that's going to be setting a quota for the next wolf hunting season. So we'll be pushing real hard to try to keep those quotas to very low levels. We are also applying for seats on the new wolf plan committee that the department is putting together. Hopefully have influence on that plan to encourage a more reasonable wolf population goal. In some ways, I'd rather the department get even away from a numerical goal and just manage the populations at current levels, perhaps try to stabilize near current levels, maybe reduce in some areas where there are conflicts, but in general, maintain a population near current levels. But avoid focusing on any exact number, because things will change and then the number becomes unachievable at some future date. And also within the plan, to recommend to the legislature changing the hunting regulations. The department has only so much authority to be able to do so. They can make recommendations, but eventually the legislature is going to have to write a new wolf hunting bill. Hopefully that'll come along at some future date that eliminates the requirement that the department has to hold a hunting season, but that the department may hold a hunting season, and emphasize more of the conservation value of wolves, and give the department more latitude as determining the start and ending dates of the hunt, the methods of take of the hunt, with extensive public input. I think if you had extensive public input, something like this use of hounds for hunting would never have occurred. It only occurred because of the special interest group that the hunting regulations were written for. So hopefully have that as part of the new plan, recommendation to the legislature for changing the future wolf hunting in Wisconsin.
Adrian, I only have one more question for you. Stephen might have a follow-up, but my last question for you is, when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
Wild places, hearing howling at night, seeing a full moon over the horizon, hearing mosquitoes buzzing in my ears. I don't know. Always a very pleasant, exciting experience.
Love it. Please give everybody information on where they can find info on the Timberwolf Alliance, Wisconsin Green Fire, and also any legislation that they can even look at for any wolf-related things in Wisconsin as well.
Can I send those to you after the broadcast here then? The links for those?
Sure. Absolutely, yeah. If everyone go to our description, I'll have all the information for Timberwolf Alliance and Wisconsin Green Fire. Adrian Wydeven, this was absolutely hugely informative. Thank you so much for spending time with Stephen and myself. It was great. Thank you. And for all the work you continue to do.
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate you.
No problem. How's to everybody out there, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the Donate tab, and find out more information.